Hey everybody, Ronnie here. I came across this article on FreightWaves. It's by Craig Fuller. He's actually the CEO of FreightWaves. And it's time for a massive load board players to take responsibility for fraud. And I thought it was really interesting, so I wanted to go ahead and read at least part of it. I want to be very clear, this is not my content, okay? This was Craig Fuller's, and it's FreightWaves. I strongly suggest everybody go to FreightWaves and sign up, okay? It's filled with really good information. But Craig says, the Wall Street Journal ran an article on April 26 detailing the load board fraud crisis and the proliferation of double brokering. As the journal reported, leading load board provider Truckstop found reports of fraud jumped by 400% from the fourth quarter of 2021 to the fourth quarter of 2022. The highest level since the firm started tracking reports in 2004. It is likely that this article didn't shock anyone in the truckload brokerage industry, because almost everyone who has worked in the industry has their own experiences with this form of fraud. FreightWaves has been reporting on load board fraud for years, shining the light on a problem that is one of the biggest drivers of inefficiency and waste. There are two major types of load board fraud: double brokering and load phishing. That's phishing with a PH. Double brokering has been around for years, while load phishing is relatively new. All right, so next he goes into how load boards are supposed to work. A broker with a load posts an opportunity on a public load board looking for a carrier to haul it. Trucking companies will identify the loads they desire to haul based on the origin and destination, the service requirements, and the commodity being hauled. Service requirements are 53-foot box van or 53-foot reefer trailer, whatever. Often the price of the broker is willing to pay is not posted alongside the transaction. Load boards work more like Craigslist than Amazon, in that the load board will list potential jobs for truckers, but the transaction is executed outside of the load board platform. Often it's done through email or through phone. With more than 16,000 freight brokerage firms and 400,000 registered motor carriers in the US, the chances are very high that the carrier and broker will have never done business together. In many ways, it's a bit like the Wild West and shockingly analog, despite investments towards digitization and freight tech that have taken place over the past decade. When a trucking carrier reaches out, the process of negotiation takes place between the broker and the carrier. Often the broker can be talking to dozens of carriers about the same load, with the intention of finding the cheapest carrier that can meet the service requirements. In a legitimate load, after the price has been negotiated between the broker and carrier, a rate con is transmitted to the carrier along with the shipment details. The carrier will then go and pick up the load, transport it to its destination, and notify the broker that the load has been handled with a signed proof of delivery. After that, the carrier bills the broker and the broker pays the carrier. Pretty straightforward, okay? One thing I want to point out is, and this is something that a lot of folks don't realize on the driver's side, is that whole bidding process, okay? The brokers are looking to make as much money as they can, and if someone's willing to take less pay to get the load, they will give that load to that person or company. That happens with almost everybody, and it certainly happens here at Super Ego. your dispatcher will bid down to try and win the load to a point, okay? It won't go down low enough to where it's not going to be profitable for anybody. And some loads are underpriced, and I've had my dispatcher go to bat for me and fight for a little bit more money to make the load worthwhile. So it works both ways. Now with double brokering, the outcome's very different. The load is sourced on a load board by a carrier that isn't what it pretends to be. In fact, the carrier may not be a trucking company at all. It is likely a third party that pretends to be a trucking company using fake documents and may not have any real trucks. The fake carrier agrees to the broker's terms of service and price offer, and then turns around and brokers the load out to a legitimate trucking company. The original broker has no clue who the carrier actually really is on the load. The legitimate trucking company picks up the load, unaware that the load received has been double brokered. The trucking company transports the load and delivers it, all while expecting to get paid. And that is where the fraud takes place. The original broker pays the illegitimate carrier, the one that actually did the double brokering, for the load service. Since the double brokering fraudster didn't have any real expense in moving the load, the entire transaction is pure profit. It doesn't intend to pay the carrier that actually took the load. The carrier that actually did take the load attempts to get paid from the double brokering fraudster. The problem is that the business isn't legitimate and it doesn't pay. By the time the carrier realizes it's been had, the double brokering fraudster has disappeared. The carrier has hauled off the load and performed the service and never gets paid. The legit broker risks having to pay twice at this point. Once to the fraudster and once to the legit carrier. While the legit broker may not know initially who the carrier is on the load, if it doesn't get paid, there's a risk that the carrier attempts to collect payment directly from the shipper, hiring a law firm or a collection agency to demand payment. An even bigger problem for double brokered loads is that the load can be stolen altogether. This is because the original broker has zero clue who is actually hauling the load to begin with. And without any information on the carrier, there's no way for the original broker to know the whereabouts of the cargo. Because the trucker received the original load from a broker, the fraudster in this case, it matched on the load board, it believes that the broker is legit. After the load's picked up, the trucker is contacted by the broker and told that the delivery destination has been changed. Naively, the trucker delivers the cargo to a compromised warehouse, completely unaware that the cargo will be stolen. The trailer is stripped and the cargo is stolen to be sold on the black market. That's, of course, if you're dropping the trailer with the load. Otherwise, they just take the load. One thing that I want to point out here, okay? Double brokering is when someone pretends to be a carrier to get the load from a broker and then re-brokers the load to a legitimate carrier. All right. That's really it. So load phishing is emerging as a major load board fraud risk as well. And this is kind of like a different type of fraud, okay? And this is strictly for stealing cargo. Load phishing starts out with a broker posting a load opportunity on the load board along with an email address. The broker receives an email from the carrier that wishes to match with the load opportunity. The negotiation between the broker and the carrier takes place, and the broker awards the load to the carrier. The problem is the person on the other end of the email isn't legitimate. He or she is using a lookalike email address or claiming to be a carrier. These fraudsters are using legitimate trucking companies' information and credentials, but they actually have zero association with the companies that they're pretending to represent. The email will look legitimate, but the address may be a letter off, or it could come from a Gmail address rather than a professional address that's pretending to be a carrier. Once the load's been booked by the fraudulent carrier, a driver picks up the load and the cargo just disappears. In many cases, the criminals who commit this form of fraud are getting smarter and more sophisticated with their efforts, as all successful criminal enterprises tend to get over time. Make no mistake, the load board fraud is not a small-time crime. Those who perpetuate it are incredibly organized and sophisticated and have found a very lucrative way to make money, a lot of money, very quickly and with little risk of prosecution. Load board fraud criminals often work from overseas, and with the proliferation of offshore brokerage call centers and service centers, it's become increasingly difficult to differentiate between a legitimate offshore brokerage or carrier staffing center and a fraudulent one. As has always been the case, the trucking industry gets little support from federal agencies or police departments that are responsible for investigating these types of crimes. When incidents are reported, the victims of such crimes, which can be everyone along the transactional chain, including shippers, carriers, and brokerages, get very little assistance from the authorities. Because load board fraud is often committed via the internet and may cross multiple jurisdictions, including international borders, as well as involving interstate commerce, investigation of these crimes should be the responsibility of the FBI. However, while the aggregate amount of these crimes is huge, the individual fraudulent transactions are usually quite small, less than a few $1,000s, an amount too low for a federal investigative agency that has much bigger crimes to deal with. Plus, load board fraud isn't well understood, even by a sophisticated investigator, much less a jury if it were to ever end up in the court system. After all, who would be expected After all, who would expect the massive $800 billion truckload industry to still transact sizable amounts of commerce on a Craigslist-like posting board? With shippers increasingly becoming victims of stolen cargo propagated through load boards, we can expect that there will be an increasing level of pressure to move freight off the public load boards and onto private 3PL networks with pre-vetted parties. If the load boards want to protect their business models, they need to step up their regulation of the marketplace and invest in fraud prevention tools. I just thought that was a very interesting story. I get a lot of folks that call me and ask about double brokering. Okay, there are videos out there with people accusing Superego of double brokering, which is not true, because Superego's not a broker, okay, and never pretends to be. Superego is the carrier, okay, and like the subsidiary company of Superego that I drive for is Rocket. The truck sitting right next to me at this truck stop, really nice guy that I helped get started here. His is with Floyd, okay, but they're all the same. They're different fleets within the same umbrella company, okay. There's no double brokering, it's just one carrier. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments down below. If you have an interest in joining Superego, feel free to give me a call. My number's on the screen, and I will put it in the description down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.